I was his mistress for 12 years, hidden away while he built his fortune with a wife who had everything. When he died, I showed up to the lawyer's office just to say goodbye. Then he started reading the will out loud, 50% to his wife, 50% to me. The words hit the air like a bomb going off in slow motion. I watched Margaret Henderson's face drain of color, watched her perfectly manicured hands grip the armrests of her leather chair until her knuckles went white. The lawyer, Thomas Brennan, kept his eyes on the document like it might protect him from what was coming. He cleared his throat and continued reading, his voice steady, despite the tension crackling through his downtown Chicago office like electricity before a storm. I'm Jessica Winters. I was 39 years old when this happened, working as a graphic designer from my small apartment in Lincoln Park. I'd met Richard Henderson at a business conference in Miami when I was 27, and he was 45. He'd approached me at the hotel bar after his keynote speech on commercial real estate development, bought me a drink, asked about my work designing marketing materials for startups. We talked for 3 hours. He made me laugh. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. He told me he was married, but unhappy. I should have walked away right then, but I didn't. For 12 years, I was the woman he came to on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, sometimes Friday afternoons if he could get away. I was the one who knew he liked his coffee black with 2 sugars, who listened when deals fell through, who held him when the pressure of running Henderson Properties got too heavy. He bought me a better apartment after year 3, paid my rent, gave me enough money that I could work part-time and not worry about bills. I told myself it wasn't prostitution because I loved him. Maybe I did. Or maybe I just loved the version of myself that existed in those stolen hours. The woman who mattered to someone powerful and successful. I never expected anything when he died. The heart attack took him at 63 while he was playing golf at his country club in Winnetka. I found out from a news alert on my phone. I cried for 2 days straight in that apartment he'd paid for, knowing I had no right to grieve publicly, no right to attend his funeral, no right to anything. When the invitation to the will reading arrived a week later, forwarded through a P.O. box he'd set up years ago for our communications, I almost didn't go. But the note attached said, "Please come. It's important. You deserve to hear this." The handwriting was Richard's. So I put on my black dress, the simple one I wore to design presentations, and drove to Brennan's office in the Loop. I walked into that conference room expecting nothing. Maybe a small token. Maybe $5,000. Maybe just acknowledgement that I'd existed in his life. Margaret was already there with their 2 adult children, Victoria and Graham, both in their 30s. Victoria looked like her mother, all sharp angles and expensive highlights. Graham had his father's build, broad shoulders, and the same intense eyes. They'd both looked at me when I entered like I was something they'd found on the bottom of their shoes. Thomas Brennan had introduced me as a business associate. The lie hung in the air for maybe 30 seconds before Margaret's expression told me she knew exactly who I was, but she'd said nothing, just stared at me with cold blue eyes while her children whispered to each other. Then Brennan started reading. The estate of Richard James Henderson, valued at approximately $500 million, consisting of commercial properties across 7 states, investment portfolios, the family home in Winnetka valued at $12 million, the vacation property in Aspen, the collection of classic cars, and all other assets, both tangible and intangible, is to be divided as follows: 50% to Margaret Elizabeth Henderson, wife of 38 years, 50% to Jessica Marie Winters, who has been a trusted companion and friend. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Margaret stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream. She said, "This is a joke. Some kind of sick joke. Richard would never. He would never do this to me. To our family." Brennan kept his voice level. He said, "Mrs. Henderson, I assure you this is Mr. Henderson's legally executed last will and testament, updated 3 months before his death. He was of sound mind. I witnessed it myself, and it was reviewed by 2 independent attorneys." Victoria stood up next to her mother. She said, "Who the hell is this woman? What did she do to my father? I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. Instead, I sat frozen in my chair, my hands clenched in my lap, barely breathing. Graham was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not quite anger. Something more like shock, mixed with disgust. Margaret turned to face me fully. She said, "You're his whore. That's who you are. You spread your legs and manipulated a sick old man into signing away his children's inheritance." I flinched like she'd slapped me. Brennan said, "Mrs. Henderson, please, let me finish reading the terms." She ignored him. She said, "I will destroy you. I will tie this up in court for years. You won't see a penny of my husband's money. I'll prove he wasn't in his right mind. I'll prove you manipulated him. By the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never met him." Her voice was shaking. Tears were running down her face, smearing her makeup. Victoria put a hand on her mother's arm, but Margaret shook her off. She said, 38 years. I gave that man 38 years of my life. I raised his children. I stood beside him at every goddamn charity gala and business dinner. I looked the other way when he worked late. When he had his conferences and business trips. I knew. Of course I knew. But I thought when it mattered, when it came down to it, he'd remember who was really there, who really built this life with him. Something in her voice cracked on those last words. For a second, just a second, I saw past the rage to the hurt underneath, to the betrayal, and I felt sick, because she was right. She'd been there. She'd earned her place in his life in ways I never had. I'd been the escape, the fantasy. She'd been the reality, the partner, the mother of his children. I found my voice. I said, "I didn't ask for this. I didn't even know he was going to do this." Margaret laughed. It was a harsh sound, no humor in it. She said, "You didn't ask? You didn't spend 12 years fucking my husband and playing house in whatever little love nest he set up for you? You didn't take his money? Didn't let him pay your bills?" I felt my face burn. I said it wasn't like that. She said, "Then what was it like, honey? Enlighten me. Explain to me how you're not a gold-digging whore who saw an opportunity and took it." Brennan stood up. He said, "That's enough. Everyone needs to calm down. Mrs. Henderson, Ms. Winters, please sit down. There's more to the will and you both need to hear it." Margaret looked like she wanted to launch herself across the table at me, but she sat down, slowly. Her children sat too, both of them still staring at me like they were trying to figure out how to make me disappear through sheer force of will. I stayed in my seat, my whole body shaking. Brennan cleared his throat again. He said, "The division of the estate is contingent upon certain conditions. The 50% allocated to Jessica Marie Winters comes with specific requirements that must be fulfilled within 6 months of Mr. Henderson's death. If these requirements are not met, her share reverts in full to Margaret Elizabeth Henderson and the Henderson children." My stomach dropped. Of course there was a catch. Of course Richard had put strings on this impossible gift. Brennan continued. He said, "Jessica Marie Winters must agree to work alongside Margaret Elizabeth Henderson in running Henderson Properties for a minimum of 1 year. All major business decisions must be made jointly. Both parties must attend all board meetings, property inspections, and investor presentations together. Ms. Winters will receive training in commercial real estate management from Mrs. Henderson herself. At the end of 1 year, if both parties agree the partnership is working, Ms. Winters will receive her full 50%. If either party refuses to participate, or if the partnership dissolves before the year is complete, Ms. Winters forfeits her claim." The room went silent again. I couldn't process what I'd just heard. Work with Margaret? Learn the business from the wife of the man I'd been sleeping with for 12 years? It was insane. It was cruel. What the hell had Richard been thinking? Margaret was staring at Brennan like he'd grown a second head. She said, "You're telling me I have to work with this woman? Train her? Teach her Richard's business so she can waltz in and take half of everything we built?" Brennan said, "Those are the terms, yes. Mr. Henderson believed that both of you played essential roles in his life and that you could learn from each other. He wanted his legacy to continue through a partnership between the two women he valued most." Victoria said, "This is bullshit. This is absolutely insane. Dad was out of his mind." Graham spoke for the first time. He said, or he knew exactly what he was doing. He always did. Everyone looked at him. He was staring at the table, his jaw tight. He said, "He always played chess while everyone else played checkers. This was deliberate." Margaret said, What are you talking about? Graham looked up at his mother. He said, think about it. He couldn't just leave everything to her without you fighting it for years. And he couldn't just leave everything to you knowing she'd have nothing after 12 years. So he found a way to force you both to deal with each other, to see each other as people instead of whatever you've been to each other all these years. Margaret looked like she'd been punched. She said, you're defending this? Graham said, I'm not defending anything. I'm just saying Dad was strategic. He always was. I finally found my voice again. I said, I can't do this. I can't work with her. She hates me. This won't work. Margaret turned to me. For a second, her expression shifted. Not to kindness, but to something like calculation. She said, no, maybe it will. Victoria said, Mom, you can't be serious. Margaret held up a hand. She said, be quiet. Let me think. She stood up and walked to the windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. 43 floors up, the city spread out below like a map. She stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute. Then she turned back to us. She said, here's what's going to happen. Jessica, you're going to take this deal. You're going to show up at the Henderson Properties office Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp. You're going to sit in the office Richard set up for his assistant, the one he never filled because he said he didn't need help, and you're going to learn everything I'm willing to teach you. Not because I like you, not because I forgive you, but because I'm not going to let my husband manipulate me from beyond the grave into fighting you while his business falls apart. We're going to run Henderson Properties together, and we're going to do it so well that when the year is up, it won't matter who owns what percentage, because the company will be worth twice what it is now. And then you and I are going to have a conversation about what happens next. I stared at her. I said, why would you agree to this? She said, because Richard knew me better than I wanted to admit. He knew I'd fight you if he just gave you half. I'd fight you into the ground and destroy myself in the process. But if he made it about the business, about protecting what we built, then I'd do what needed to be done. That bastard knew exactly what he was doing, and I'm not going to prove him right by letting everything fall apart out of spite. She walked back to the table and stood directly in front of me. She said, but make no mistake, I don't like you. I don't forgive you. And if you screw this up, if you cost me one deal, one client, $1 of value, I will make sure you walk away with nothing. Do we understand each other? I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. She said, good, then we have a deal. Brennan, draw up whatever papers we need to sign. Victoria said, Mom, this is crazy. Margaret said, no. What's crazy is letting some woman I've never met walk away with half of everything your father and I spent 4 decades building without me having any say in how it's used. At least this way I have control. At least this way I can protect the business. Graham was watching his mother with something like respect in his eyes. He said, she's got a point, Victoria. Victoria looked furious, but she sat back down. She said, fine, but I want it on record that I think this is a terrible idea. Over the next 6 months, I learned more about commercial real estate, business management, and the complicated man Richard Henderson had been than I had in 12 years of Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Margaret was a brutal teacher. She was never warm, never friendly, but she was thorough. She walked me through every property in the portfolio, every investor relationship, every market trend that affected their holdings. She made me sit through endless meetings where developers pitched projects, and investors asked probing questions about return on investment and risk assessment. The first month was hell. Margaret barely spoke to me except to give instructions or corrections. She made me review 10 years of financial statements. She made me memorize the details of every property, every tenant, every lease agreement. When I made mistakes, she pointed them out with cold precision. When I got things right, she said nothing. I worked 14-hour days trying to keep up. My hands cramped from taking notes. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. But slowly, something started to shift. Around week 6, we were touring a warehouse property in Gary, Indiana that was losing money. The tenant was behind on rent. The building needed repairs, and the neighborhood was declining. Margaret was ready to sell at a loss. I suggested converting it to artist studios and small business incubators, pointing out the proximity to Chicago and the growing trend of artists being priced out of the city. She'd looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Then she'd pulled out her phone and started making calls to arts organizations. That property became one of our most successful projects. The conversion attracted a mix of artists, small manufacturers, and tech startups. Within 6 months, it was fully leased with a waiting list. The local press did a feature on the revitalization. Margaret had included me in the interview. She'd said, "My associate Jessica had the vision for this project. It's a good example of thinking creatively about underutilized assets." My associate. Not her name. Not acknowledgement of who I'd been to Richard. But not hostility either. Progress. Around month 4, we were having coffee in her office after a particularly brutal negotiation with a difficult investor. She'd said, "You're better at this than I expected. Richard always said you were smart. I thought he was just. I thought it was something men said about their mistresses to justify the relationship. But you actually understand this business." I'd said, "Thank you, I think." She'd leaned back in her chair. She'd said, "Why did you stay with him? For 12 years. You could have found someone available. Someone who could give you a real life. Why stay hidden?" I'd thought about lying. About giving her some easy answer. But I owed her honesty at this point. I'd said, "I told myself it was love. Maybe it was, at first. But after a while, I think I stayed because it was safe. No demands. No pressure to be perfect. He came to me twice a week and I could just be. When he left, I had my own life. My own space. It felt like freedom. Until it didn't. Until I realized I'd spent 12 years of my life waiting for someone who was never fully mine." Margaret had looked at me for a long moment. She'd said, "He wasn't fully mine either. Even before you. There was always something distant about Richard, like part of him was somewhere else. I thought for years it was the business. The next deal. The next property. After a while, I stopped trying to reach that part of him. I focused on the kids, the house, the social obligations. We were partners in building something. But were we in love? I don't know. Maybe we never were. Or maybe we were once and lost it somewhere along the way. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. Maybe the most honest conversation either of us had ever had with anyone about Richard. Month 5, Margaret got a call from a developer in Texas who wanted to buy 3 of their best properties in Houston. The offer was huge, $50 million above market value. Margaret was ready to take it, but something felt wrong to me. I spent a weekend digging into the developer's background, following threads through business filings and news archives. I found a pattern. He bought properties, held them for exactly 18 months, then flipped them to a specific investment group for massive markups. That investment group had ties to money laundering investigations in 3 states. Monday morning, I walked into Margaret's office and showed her everything I'd found. She'd read through the documents with increasing tension in her jaw. Then she'd picked up the phone and called the developer. She'd said, "Thank you for your generous offer, but Henderson Properties is not interested in selling at this time." She'd hung up and looked at me. She'd said, "If we'd taken that deal and it came out later that the buyer was dirty, it could have destroyed our reputation." "You just saved this company," I'd said. "I'm protecting my investment too." She'd almost smiled. She'd said, "Fair point." Month 7. We were planning the end-of-year strategy meeting when Victoria showed up at the office. She'd barely spoken to me since the will reading. She walked into my office without knocking and said, "I need to understand something. Why are you still here? The year is almost up. You could take your money and run. Why are you still working 80-hour weeks on properties you'll own half of anyway?" I'd looked up from the market analysis I'd been preparing. I'd said, "Because I want to know what I'm inheriting. I want to understand what your father built. And honestly, I'm good at this. I didn't know I would be. But I am. This is the first time in my life I've felt like I'm doing something that matters beyond just surviving." Victoria had studied me. She'd said, "My mother respects you. I can tell. She doesn't want to, but she does. That's really strange for me." I'd said, "It's strange for me too. I expected her to hate me forever. Maybe she still does, but we've found a way to work together. That's more than I thought possible." Victoria had nodded slowly. She'd said, "For what it's worth, I've seen the projects you've worked on. The artist incubator in Gary, the mixed-use development in Milwaukee, the affordable housing initiative in Detroit. Those were your ideas. They're good. They're better than good. My father would have been proud. It was the kindest thing any of Richard's family had said to me. I'd felt tears sting my eyes. I'd said, "Thank you. That means more than you know." Month 8, Margaret called me into her office after everyone else had gone home. It was 9 p.m. on a Friday. We'd been working on a major acquisition deal all week, a portfolio of office buildings in Columbus that would expand Henderson Properties into Ohio. She'd poured 2 glasses of wine and handed me one. She'd said, "I have a confession. When Richard died, I was relieved." Is that terrible? We'd been married for 38 years, but I felt relieved. Because I didn't have to pretend anymore. Pretend to be interested in his golf stories. Pretend to care about his business dinners. Pretend that we were still the couple we'd been when we got married. We'd become business partners who shared a house, roommates with a legal contract. The love had died years ago, but neither of us wanted to admit it. I'd said, "Why didn't you leave?" She'd said, "Money, security, fear, pride, take your pick." We had a life that looked perfect from the outside. Giving that up felt like admitting failure. And what would I have done? I'd spent my whole adult life being Mrs. Richard Henderson. I didn't know who Margaret Henderson was without him. She'd paused, swirling the wine in her glass. She'd said, "These past 8 months, running this business with you, fighting for every deal, learning new approaches. This is the first time in decades I've felt like myself, like I have my own identity. And I hate that you're part of why that happened. I hate that it took my husband's mistress to make me remember I'm capable of more than hosting charity luncheons." I'd said, "I never wanted to hurt you. I know that doesn't mean much now, but it's true. I didn't think about you very much, which makes me a terrible person. You were abstract. The wife. The obstacle. Not a real person with feelings and a life. I'm sorry for that, for not seeing you as human." She'd looked at me with those cold blue eyes that had become slightly less cold over the months. She'd said, "I didn't see you as human either. You were the threat." The other woman. The thing that proved my marriage was a lie. But you're not. You're just a person who made choices, same as me. Maybe not great choices. But whose are? We'd sat in silence for a moment, sipping wine and watching the city lights through her office window. Then she'd said, "I have a proposal. The year is almost up. You'll get your 50%. You've more than earned it, to be honest. But I don't want this partnership to end. I think we're better together than either of us would be alone. So here's what I'm proposing. We keep going. We keep building Henderson Properties together. Equal partners. Equal say in all decisions. And we start a second venture, a development fund focused specifically on revitalization projects like the Gary Warehouse. Properties everyone else has given up on, that we can transform into something valuable. We'll call it Winters Henderson Development. Your name first, because it'll be your vision driving it. I'll handle the financing and business structure. You'll handle the creative development and project management." I'd stared at her. I'd said, "You want to start a company with me? After everything?" She'd said, "I want to build something new. Something that's ours, not Richard's. He left us this weird partnership because he couldn't figure out how to deal with his own choices in life. Fine. But we don't have to be prisoners of his guilt. We can take what he gave us and make it into something better, something that's about what we want, not what he wanted for us." I'd felt something crack open in my chest. Hope, maybe, or possibility. I'd said, "What about Victoria and Graham? Will they accept this?" She'd said, "Graham already told me he thinks we're the best thing that's happened to the company in years. Victoria is coming around. She sees the value you bring, and honestly, they're both relieved they don't have to run the business. Victoria is a photographer. Graham is a teacher. Neither of them wanted this life. They want their inheritance secure, but they don't want to manage properties and court investors. This works for everyone." I'd said, "Okay. Yes. I'm in." She'd held up her glass. She'd said, "To unexpected partnerships." I'd clinked my glass against hers. I'd said, "To women who figure out how to move forward." Month 9. We signed the papers for Winters Henderson development. The legal team looked confused by the structure but got it done. We celebrated by buying a completely derelict apartment building in Bronzeville and spending 3 weeks developing plans for turning it into affordable housing with ground floor retail. Margaret brought in investors. I brought in architects and community organizers. We worked side by side, arguing over details, compromising, finding solutions neither of us would have thought of alone. The year mark came and went without ceremony. The lawyer sent official documents confirming my 50% ownership of Henderson Properties. I signed them. Margaret signed them. We went back to work. 3 years later, I'm 42, and sitting in the office I share with Margaret at our new headquarters in the West Loop. Winters Henderson Development has revitalized 7 properties across the Midwest, creating 200 affordable housing units and 60 small business spaces. Henderson Properties is worth $800 million, triple what it was when Richard died. Victoria is our official company photographer, documenting our projects for marketing materials. Graham teaches business ethics at Northwestern and uses our company as a case study in sustainable development practices. Margaret and I have dinner once a month, always at this Italian place in River North. We talk about business mostly, sometimes about life. She's dating someone, a widower she met at a charity event. He makes her laugh. I'm single. I dated for a while, but nothing stuck. I'm okay with that. I'm learning to be enough on my own. Sometimes I think about Richard, about what he meant to do with that will. Graham was right. Richard was playing chess. He knew Margaret would never accept me if he just gave me half the money. She'd fight it, waste years and millions in court, destroy herself with bitterness. But if he made it about the business, about protecting what they'd built, she'd swallow her pride and do what needed to be done. And he knew that working together, we'd eventually see each other as more than symbols. We'd become real to each other. People with strengths and flaws and value. Was it manipulative? Absolutely. Richard controlled people even in death, setting up this elaborate chess game where we had to play his moves to get what he'd promised. Was it brilliant? Maybe. Because it worked. We did become partners. We did build something neither of us could have built alone. But here's what Richard didn't anticipate. We stopped playing his game. We took the partnership he forced on us and turned it into something that belonged to us, not to his memory. We built Winters Henderson Development not because he wanted us to reconcile or because he had some vision of feminine unity. We built it because we discovered we worked well together, because we each had strengths that complemented the other's weaknesses, because sometimes the people who are supposed to be enemies can become the best collaborators if they're forced to actually see each other. Margaret and I aren't friends exactly. We don't share secrets or get drunk together or text each other memes. But we trust each other. We respect each other. We've built something real together out of Richard's manipulation and our own stubborn refusal to let his choices define us. The sunset over Chicago tonight is spectacular, painting the skyline in orange and gold. I can see the warehouse in Gary from here on clear days, converted now into a thriving arts hub with a waiting list a mile long. I can see the future projects scattered across the Midwest, derelict buildings waiting to become homes and businesses and community centers. I can see 3 years of hard work paying off in tangible ways. Some women inherit fortunes through marriage, some through luck. I inherited mine through 12 years of being the other woman, followed by 1 year of becoming someone I'd never planned to be. A business owner, a developer, a partner to the woman I'd wronged. Life is strange that way. The worst thing you've ever done can become the doorway to becoming someone better than you were. I don't know if I deserve what I have. I don't know if there's some cosmic scoreboard where my years as a mistress disqualify me from happiness or success. But I do know this. I work my ass off every single day to prove that Richard's weird, manipulative gamble on me wasn't wasted. I show up. I make good decisions. I protect what Margaret and I have built together. I try to create value for the people who live and work in the properties we develop. And maybe that's enough. Maybe redemption isn't about erasing the past or being forgiven. Maybe it's about taking the mess you've made and building something worthwhile on top of it. About being more than your worst choices. about finding partnership in the strangest places and having the courage to see it through, even when everyone says it won't work. The city sparkles below me as the last of the daylight fades. Margaret will be here in 20 minutes for our weekly strategy meeting. We're looking at a property in Detroit, an old factory that could become mixed-use lofts and makerspaces. She'll have run the numbers. I'll have the creative vision. We'll argue about timelines and budgets and design elements. We'll find a compromise that's better than either of our original ideas. We'll get it done. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over when Richard died. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. Turned out I'd lost a fantasy and gained a future. Not the one I'd imagined. Something harder and more complicated and more real. Something I built with my own hands alongside a woman who had every reason to hate me, but chose partnership instead. And you know what? I'll take real over fantasy any day. Even if real comes with conditions, complications, and a business partner who still occasionally looks at me like she's calculating whether I'm worth the trouble. Because real is mine. Real is earned. Real doesn't disappear when someone dies, or when the fantasy can't be maintained anymore. Richard left us 50-50, but what Margaret and I built together? That's 100% ours, and it's worth more than any inheritance could ever be.